I was just pulling into my driveway after a long day at work when I noticed a police cruiser parked beside the community pond. In our peaceful little neighborhood of Lakewood Trails, a police car usually meant only one thing, that our HOA president, Melinda Crawford, was at it again. And judging by the way she stood there by the water, arms crossed like a queen surveying her subjects, I knew trouble was brewing. Melinda wasn't your average HOA president. Tall, with icy blue eyes and a sharp, angular face framed by a perfectly styled platinum blonde bob, she always wore her crisp navy power suits like battle armor. Her polished pearl necklace glinted in the afternoon sun, and pinned to her lapel was a gold HOA badge, as if she fancied herself the sheriff of Lakewood Trails. As I stepped out of my car and walked toward the pond, I could already hear her voice slicing through the air like a scalpel. The target of her fury was none other than George Whitaker, a 76-year-old Vietnam veteran and one of the longest-standing residents of our neighborhood. George, with his weathered tan skin and faded hazel eyes, sat on his favorite bench by the water's edge. He wore his usual checkered flannel shirt and khaki pants, a battered Vietnam veteran cap shading his face as he calmly fished. George had lived here since 1990, back when Lakewood Trails was little more than farmland and the pond was a gathering spot for locals. Every morning for over 3 decades, he made his way down to that same spot with a fishing rod in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other. The pond wasn't just a feature of the neighborhood to him, it was home. But to Melinda, it was a prime piece of real estate waiting to be locked down under HOA control. Melinda had only lived in Lakewood Trails for about 2 years, but in that short time, she had transformed the community. It started with mailbox regulations, then came the approved paint color list, which somehow only included shades of beige and gray. Soon after, she enforced landscaping standards so strict, it felt like we were living in a country club. But her latest crusade was the pond. That morning, George had taken his usual place by the water around 7 a.m., enjoying the quiet and casting his line. At about 8, Melinda appeared, striding down the gravel path in her power suit, stilettos clicking against the stone. Despite it being a Saturday, she announced, with all the authority of a headmistress, that as of today, pond access required a $75 monthly permit from the HOA. Without it, no fishing, no boating, no gathering. George calmly reminded her that his property deed included fishing rights at the pond, rights his father had negotiated when the land was sold to developers. Melinda didn't care. She ordered him to leave. When he refused, she called the police. By the time I reached the scene, a crowd of neighbors had gathered. People of all ages and backgrounds, retirees, young parents, kids on bikes, people walking their dogs, stood around watching the spectacle unfold. Phones were out. Everyone was filming. The responding officer was Deputy Chris Ramirez, a young Latino cop, probably not long out of the academy. He was polite, calm, and doing his best to mediate. Melinda immediately shoved a manila folder at him, claiming it contained documents proving the HOA owned the pond and surrounding land. She went into a long, practiced monologue about property values, community standards, and liability risks, growing more confident with every word. Then came the twist. When Deputy Ramirez asked George for any documentation of his own, George reached into his old tackle box and pulled out a weathered envelope. Inside was a deed dated 1990. The officer studied it for a moment, then stepped aside to make a phone call to county records. The air hung heavy as we all waited. Melinda paced impatiently, shooting smug glances at the crowd like a schoolteacher waiting to punish a disobedient student. George sat quietly, his fishing line still rippling the water. After a few tense minutes, Deputy Ramirez hung up, cleared his throat, and spoke. According to county records, he said, the pond and a 50-foot easement around it had never been legally transferred to the HOA. Due to a clerical error during the community's incorporation, the land remained under a public trust, with specific easement rights granted to George Whitaker's property deed. Not only was George legally permitted to fish there, he was the only resident with formally documented access rights. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. Melinda's face turned from smug to pale to visibly panicked. She demanded to speak to the officer's supervisor. She claimed it was a mistake. But word spread through the onlookers like wildfire. People pulled up the HOA website on their phones, reading the pages about pond permits and fines. Someone asked if they could get refunds for the fees they'd paid. Another shouted about how the HOA had been threatening residents with legal action over pond usage when they apparently had no authority. Within the hour, two county officials arrived. One of them, Patricia Holloway, a no-nonsense woman with silver-streaked hair, sharp brown eyes behind reading glasses, and a reputation for cutting through red tape, took charge. After reviewing the documents and the county records herself, she confirmed what Deputy Ramirez had discovered. The HOA's claim to the pond was invalid. Worse still, Melinda had been collecting thousands of dollars in illegal pond permit fees. She issued a cease and desist order on the spot. All pond access restrictions were lifted immediately. Every dollar collected in permit fees would be refunded, and an audit of the HOA's property claims was ordered. Melinda's humiliation was complete when Patricia made her issue a public apology right there by the pond. George, still calmly fishing, became an instant local hero. Neighbors cheered. Some asked to join him fishing the next morning, but the fallout was just getting started. That evening, an emergency HOA board meeting was held. 3 board members resigned on the spot, condemning Melinda's reckless leadership. The remaining members voted to hire a legal team to assess the HOA's liability. The results were devastating. Not only did the HOA owe thousands in refunds, but the loss of control over the pond reduced the community's asset value by over $2 million. An investigation by the HOA's insurance company revealed even worse. Melinda had been sending cease and desist letters to residents, threatening lawsuits for pond usage violations she had no authority to enforce. She'd collected over $15,000 in illegal permit fees and even convinced the board to take out a loan using the pond as collateral on property the HOA didn't own. Then came the big one. The state attorney general opened a fraud investigation after several residents filed formal complaints. It turned out Melinda had been listing the pond as an HOA asset on loan applications and community marketing materials, potentially committing fraud. When the local news picked up the story, the headline read, HOA president calls cops on elderly veteran, loses $2 million asset. It was over. Melinda's real estate license was suspended. She was formally removed as HOA president in a landslide community vote, 218-5. When residents started publicly listing her many abuses of power, from fining a widow $500 for painting her mailbox the wrong shade of beige to threatening a disabled veteran over his wheelchair ramp, her remaining supporters disappeared. A second vote passed to pursue legal action against her personally for negligence and misrepresentation. The HOA's attorney announced that Melinda could be held liable for over $400,000 in civil penalties. Rumors swirled that she faced up to 5 years in prison if the fraud charges stuck. When the final decision came down, Melinda grabbed her papers, her face streaked with tears, and fled the clubhouse. Her designer heels echoed frantically on the tile floor as she bolted for her car and sped away into the night. George, meanwhile, kept fishing. And that pond? It belongs to the people again.